Hello students, this is Professor Popley introducing you to week 3's lecture and assignments. I want to just quickly go over a few important parts of this week's discussion and content. This week you will be looking at the external environment and the competitive environment that influence the strategic decisions that businesses in a particular industry need to make. Your discussion board will be as usual. You will use the content from this week's lecture and readings to discuss certain issues related to the U.S. airline industry, and that'll be on your discussion board. You also, for the first time, will have the first part of a 6-part application, which will be due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Central Time, and this will be an ongoing application. 6 parts, all of them applying to an analysis of Starbucks. So I think this will be kind of fun because it's a company that you're all familiar with and also are customers of. The third thing I wanted to remind you or get you thinking about is there is a large project that is due in 2 pieces that have to do with using all of the components of the course to do an analysis of a case study, and the case study is Southwest Airlines. It's important that you start looking at that this week because the first half of that assignment is due the beginning of week 6, and the second half is due at the end of the course, but you want to look at it soon so you don't get crunched for time because it does ask for a lot of analysis that's very important. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we get into the lecture is some definitions so that we're all, you're aware and we're all talking about the same things. An industry is how do we define an industry? An industry is a group of companies offering products or services that are close substitutes for one another. So you could say the hotels is an industry. Restaurants are an industry. They're a group of companies that are in a particular type of service or product. A sector is something larger. It's larger than, and so multiple industries fit inside a sector. So for hotels and restaurants, for instance, we're part of the hospitality sector, and even could see this in terms of the tourism sector. Market segments is a different term and doesn't really relate to companies. It really relates to the customers. When we talk about market segments, we're talking about different groups of customers for different businesses. So, for instance, there are multiple market segments for the hotel industry that are appropriate, that are customers for different types of hotels. So for one market segment may be very affluent travelers who are looking for a highly sensory experience, and of course they would be the market segment that the Ritz-Carlton appeals to, whereas an American Inn appeals to a very different market segment, not the same customer. So it's a way to make sure that you are aware of these terms. Okay, so let me go just launch right into some of the key things from this week's readings and lecture materials that I hope you'll really pay attention to because you're going to need to use them. One of the big pieces is that there is a competitive environment in which all businesses in a particular industry are in and are subject to a variety of forces. So this is Porter's 5 forces analysis, and you're going to be using this to analyze Southwest Airline as well as using this to analyze Starbucks. So the idea behind Porter's theory is that all businesses in a particular industry are in a constant state of rivalry with one another. They are competing at all times for resources, customers, and other issues. There are outside forces that are part of this competitive environment. One is important concept is the risk of entry and actually exit as well. But the risk of entry, how easy or hard is it for a business to get into an industry? You might think about manufacturing and you realize how that tends to be a much tougher industry to get into. It requires higher capital investment. It has longer lead times. It's harder to get rid of inventory if you get try to get out of the business. So there's a lot at stake, making the manufacturing sector a high barrier to entry. On the other end of the spectrum, you might look at restaurants. The ability for individuals with limited means to start a restaurant is very high. So it's a very low barrier to entry. With just a little bit of regulation and a little bit of money, anyone can get in the industry. So that can affect how the kinds of decisions that businesses in that industry have to make regarding how they market themselves, how they manage themselves, how they get labor, etc. Other issues are threats of substitutes. Good thing to think about here is that when you think about businesses, you often think of them competing with one another, like the same type versus one another, so hotel to hotel. But a threat of substitute is for you to think about that customers often have many other ways to satisfy the same need. A hotel may not be the only way to satisfy someone's need for a place to stay. And Airbnb has really demonstrated that. So that they're a very good example of how a substitute can come into a market and change the competitive environment. Another one is the power of complementary providers, and that is maybe not hotels but resorts, extended stay properties, other kinds of condos and rentals. Those kinds of other types of providers can make an impact on the competitive environment. And then, obviously, the buyer has bargaining power in the relationship. We all know that we use our money and reward certain businesses with our business. So often the buyer has a lot of bargaining power in the relationship with the customer. That's true particularly in hospitality, where there are so many choices now, and there's so much rivalry that the customer can bargain for the best prices. That is not true in some other industries where there may be fewer companies serving more people. So you may pay more, let's say the iPhone would be a good example of that, where the bargaining power is limited for the customer because there are fewer providers providing that particular product, and they're able to command a higher price. The bargaining power of suppliers is another very important piece. If raw materials, if labor, if other important components of a business are more scarce, they may be harder to get and the cost may be higher to the business, and that affects their ability to compete. If suppliers are plentiful, they can get what they need anywhere at a very low cost, then the business has more bargaining power. So the next piece I want to talk about is the stages in the industry life cycle, because depending on where an industry is in its life cycle, that can influence greatly the competitive environment for businesses in it. So at the very beginning, in the embryonic stage, the growth is slow because people don't know about the product. The prices are high. Think about the early days of the personal computer or the early days of the cell phone. Barriers to entry are pretty high still because the expertise and the ability to put that product into the marketplace is relatively limited. Once the industry enters the growth stage, though, demand starts to expand more rapidly than supply, and so prices start to fall. There's more economies of scale. Distribution channels are set up. Think about then, in the great run-up when the mobile phone began to really explode. Threats from professional competitors is highest at this stage, and rivalry is low because there's so much demand out there, anybody can get in. So thinking about tablets or thinking about the mobile phone industry at that stage. At a certain point, though, demand reaches more of a saturation level, and there are fewer potential first-time buyers.